Hello, learners, and welcome to the 60th and the last lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I'll conclude the discussion of the writer and the novelist that I began in the previous lecture and offer some thoughts summing up the cultural as well as intellectual terrain that we've covered in this course. Before I do that, I want to read a few passages from Memories of Rain, which, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is among the most powerful reading experiences I've had of late. And I just want to share some of those very, very incredible moments and offer some guidelines and some frameworks for understanding and appreciating that literary power. So, I mentioned in the previous lecture that there's one very obvious difference between literary modernism and post-colonial writing. And that difference is that while literary modernism seems to focus on form, post-colonial writing seems to focus on issues of history or the nation. And that's a good frame for understanding the way Memories of Rain is written. Memories of Rain is a novel that's about a woman who has decided to return to India, to return to a nation that exerts an oversized influence on the writing of many novelists in the late 90s as well as the early 2000s. The Nation and Narration is the title of a book by Homi Bhabha. But other than the book, the question of the fate of the Indian nation, it has almost become like an albatross around the neck of novelists. Every Indian novelist with publishing ambitions is in some ways expected to answer this question, which is to say, what is the place of India? What is the meaning of India? What does India mean? So these kinds of very large public questions. And what we find in the work of select group of very intelligent, very sensitive, very perceptive writers, and I gave the example of Ghosh's The Shadow Lines, which in my view is a very, very powerful novel and worth reading for anyone trying to understand Indian English writing. Like The Shadow Lines, Memories of Rain also engages with the large public question of the history and the fate of the Indian nation, but does so in a very, very indirect manner. There are some descriptions of urban as well as rural India in this novel, which are no less detailed and offer no less ethnographic or anthropological or economic or cultural realism than any writing by a historian or a journalist or anyone writing in more objective styles. And yet, in this novel, those descriptions of India are not given as descriptions of India. Rather, they are given as part of a person's memories. So those descriptions of Calcutta in the 70s, of villages, of poor people trying to make a living, they are quite literally memories of rain. And in a way, those descriptions are memories of rain. That is to say, they are subjective impressions, much more so than they are documentary evidences or documentary pieces of information that can be used to build a historical or a scholarly archive of what India is. I'll read a little bit from the opening page of the novel to give you all a sense of how immersive and how powerful this novel is. I have a lot to say about the style of the novel and about the kind of emotional mood or the structure of feeling that the particular style of Sunetra Gupta's writing creates, but I'll talk about that after I read from the opening section. So this is from the second paragraph. There's a paragraph that begins describing that time, that is 70s Calcutta, and which justifies the title of the novel as Memories of Rain. Even he, the first time she ever set eyes upon him, had disgusted and fascinated her, the dark hairs plastered to his chalk-white legs, for this was the flood of 78, and he had just waded through knee-deep water, he and her brother, all the way from the Academy of Fine Arts to their house in Ballygunge. He had rolled up his jeans, revealing his alabaster calves which dripped the sewage of Calcutta onto the floor of their veranda, and that was what caused her to tremble in excitement and loathing as she pushed aside the curtain with a tray of tea and toast. His large, corpse-white, muck-rinded toes pushed against the bamboo table, soiling the mats she had crocheted in school. She set down the tea. Her brother did not bother to introduce her, but Anthony asked, "Is this your sister?" And she had nodded vaguely and smiled, picked up the book that she had been reading all afternoon, there on the veranda all afternoon, watching the rain. In her room, which she shared with her grandmother, the moldy smell of a deep, long rain was settling in, compounded by the muddy strokes of the maid who had picked this unlikely hour to wash the floors. She tiptoed gingerly across and flung open the shutters, letting in a spray of rain. Her grandmother, coming in with the sewing machine, pleaded with her to shut them. Her old bones would freeze, she said, so she drew them in again and switched on the much despised fluorescent light, and lay with her face towards the damp wall, lulled by the whir of the sewing machine and the ever-loudening beat of the raindrops, until the lights went out, as they did every night and every morning, the inevitable power rationing, and she was summoned to take out to her brother and his white friend a kerosene light. And so she appeared to him a second time, lantern lit in the damp darkness, a phantom of beauty, and his eyes roamed for a time after she had disappeared inside, the ghost of light that her presence had left, there beside him in the rain-swollen dark. He saw her again at dinner, candlelit, their first dinner, and she sat well back in the darkness, so that he could only gaze upon the flames that danced upon her delicate fingers, the drapes of her sari that fell upon the formica tabletop. And as they were being served yogurt, the lights came on again, the house sprang into action, the fans whipped up the clammy cold air, the water pump revived, Beethoven resumed on the record player. "I'd rather you didn't leave the player on during load shedding," said their father. Their grandmother shivered. "The rain will go on for a few days now," she said. "I can feel it in my bones. Those poor villagers." So, a very long paragraph, and those of you who've been paying attention will notice that the writing style is kind of breathless, that there are extremely long sentences. Some sentences seem to go on and on. They seem to not use the period or the full stop, and they seem to keep using commas a lot, adding subclauses and subclauses after subclauses. Now, in a way, this, or superficially speaking, this may appear to be a style that doesn't end. It's a style that may be judged to be inferior because it may appear to be a form of powerlessness. It may seem to signify a lack of control or an inability on the part of the narrator, or an inability or a lack of judgment on the part of the narrator to know when to stop a thought and when to start developing another thought again. This would be a very mistaken judgment, however, because that's not what's happening here. In fact, far from it. In fact, this is a narrator and this is a writer who is in supreme control and supreme command over their thoughts and the way these thoughts are formulated into a narrative. So the things to note, and I'll quickly note a few things before moving on. The things to note in this opening paragraph are that there's a repeated mention of a few things. There's a repeated mention of the whiteness of Anthony's body, his arm, his legs, and how starkly and how sharply this whiteness contrasts with and stands out from its current surroundings. This is an afternoon of a flood, and in this setting, in this extremely chaotic setting, when this incessant rain has really turned life upside down, in this middle-class household in the year 1978, middle class but extremely educated, extremely steeped in all the trapments of high culture. There's Beethoven that's playing from the radio. The protagonist, who is tasked with bringing tea and toast, is reading a novel in her free time. She has enough of preference and enough of a taste to crave natural light, and has a sort of condescension and aversion, almost hatred, for the fluorescent light. And also, fluorescent light is a very clear marker of the state of technological and economic development that this family was in. In fact, even today, in many households, fluorescent lights are the preferred and the chosen mode of lighting, because the power to light ratio is better and more economical for fluorescent light than it is for warm white or more incandescent forms of lighting. One would need to switch on more incandescent bulbs and therefore spend more money, and therefore also consume more energy for the same amount of lighting than one would need to do with the fluorescent light. And all of this signifies a sort of mismatch between the material circumstances, the limited resources of the reality, and in some ways the fate that Moni is born into, and the kind of cultural sensibilities that at this point in Moni's life and career she is used to and she is growing used to. Which is to say, at this stage, Moni, who is a student of English literature, is fascinated by certain cultural things, tends to idealize certain things. And the whiteness of Tony's legs, which stand out in a somewhat strange and almost ugly manner, the inconvenience that they cause, because we are told that his legs are dirty from the sewage because he's walked in a flooded street. And he's come inside Moni's house and he's put these dirty feet on the mats which Moni has crocheted and probably also done something to keep clean. But the point is that this inconvenience of soiling things which were very painstakingly cleaned, that inconvenience is not really registered. In fact, what is registered is something of the exotic nature. And the rest of the section will explain how Moni's reading of English literature serves as a cultural bridge, and not just a bridge, but in fact becomes a catalyst for the romance between these two individuals. In their earliest conversation, Tony asks Moni what she's reading, and when she says Keats, Tony recites a line from Ode on Melancholy and says, "Go not to Leith." And somehow it is Tony's voice reciting Keats's Ode on Melancholy which stays in Moni's mind, and she remembers it in bed later that evening. Now, I'll quickly move on to some other moments. We are told that Tony's attitude and approach as a visitor in 1978 Calcutta is that of an Orientalist. Tony is part of a theatre group. He's a budding playwright, and he has visited Calcutta to meet with other playwrights, other actors, other students who are working in this very culturally sensitive theatre group. And so 1978 is also a time when Naxalism was fresh in the minds of a lot of people, and especially in Calcutta. So everyone in Moni's group, her brother is a playwright, many of her friends work in theatre, they all have extremely sharp and what we would call today liberal sensibilities. They also have a very strong socialist bent of mind. And so Tony's attitude towards poverty, towards feudalism, towards social inequality fits very easily with the cultural sensibility of these Indians. The narrator, however, allows us to view this easy fit between this white man's critique of feudalism. He's coming from a 60s British socialist movement. That this easy fit, however, should not be taken as something very nice and very fortunate, but rather one should be skeptical towards it. And it is in this gaze that the narrator creates for us, inviting us to look at Tony's critique of Bengal poverty, of feudalism and poverty in Bengal, as part of an Orientalist gaze. This prepares us to understand and accept what Moni would later discover in Tony's infidelity. So it is that same attitude. It is an extractive mentality. It is an extractive approach. It's an extremely selfish and self-centered approach because Tony seems to view people, that is to say, in this case, the poor people of West Bengal in 1978, and later his own wife, as pawns that exist for his personal gratification. He will treat Moni as an extremely pitiable creature, as a creature who cannot support herself on her own, who needs the care and the love, almost like a child needs the care of a parent. Many years later, when his passion, which the narrator very frequently describes as a kind of tropical lust, many years after Tony's so-called tropical lust for Moni has faded, he will continue to repeat this word love, and he will continue to declare that he loves Moni and he would like her to be happy and he would like her to be safe and secure and prosperous, which means for Tony that he would support her as the mother of his child, but he would not give to Moni that deeper emotional part of himself which he had reserved for Anna, who is a common friend of both of them and with whom Tony has been carrying on a relationship for quite a long time. So in this early phase, we can see how in this liberal socialist view of looking at social inequality, there hides this very, very deep and somewhat insidious and extractive mentality. There are a great deal of references to many cultural texts. Most frequent and in fact the one writer who looms large across these pages is Rabindranath Tagore. Moni is learning to sing and is also learning to write. She frequently sings poems from Tagore and recites them, sings them, and these words are reproduced for us in English. And these words reinforce the elegiac mood of this first section, in which the narrator describes, or the narrator performs, a sort of memorialization for Moni by describing memories that Moni herself maybe has suppressed and presents them in the right and the most critical possible frame. There are also many other writers. I named John Keats, but several other writers are frequently referred to. And this is, in that sense, a very, very cerebral and intellectual kind of a novel. It's a novel that depends for its full appreciation on readers recognizing what it means to pursue a life of the mind. Both the protagonists, despite their, or in spite of their sins, the emotional sins and their behavior, their moral or immoral behavior, which is condemned for right reasons, irrespective of their behavior, they pursue a very active and very rich and very real life of the mind. And the narrator describes this life of the mind in almost painstaking detail. So there's a very deep and sophisticated recreation of the thoughts of both of these characters, that is Moni Deepa and her husband Anthony. We are given a very deep insight into the process by which these two individuals try to think, try to write, try to compose things, and also the way they frequently arrive at their emotional impasses. I'll pause here to make a comment about the style and the kind of emotional atmosphere this novel creates. The metaphor that comes to mind most frequently is the metaphor of water. The prose of this novel flows like water, and the prose of this novel creates this emotional effect of waves in a sea that periodically but unevenly lap against a very hard object at the shore, like a stony cliff or a rocky sort of coast. And I say that because the narrative very frequently revisits decisions and conclusions which had once seemed certain. Nothing is certain in this novel until the weekend is concluded. That is to say, Moni Deepa frequently questions the certainty, the validity, the sustainability, and the value, and ultimately the rightness of the decision that she has taken. Her resolve does not falter, but she often pauses to consider multiple perspectives. And one of these perspectives is that of what would have happened to her, a sort of counterfactual imagination of what would have happened to her if she had chosen a different life. There are two things that matter here. First is Monideepa wonders what would her life have been if instead of Anthony, she had gotten married to someone more typical, someone who would not have surprised or shocked her parents and family to the extent that Anthony did. This is present on page 27, and I'll just read briefly from there. Remembers her wedding, the great amounts of food that was prepared, and how this appeared to be different from what would have happened otherwise. Hunger gnaws at her. Outside in the mild winter night, large vats of food are rotting. Mounds of pilau rice, piles of fried rice, cauldrons of oily meat, boxes of sweetmeats, the excess from last night's feast, they will flow in rivers through the drains of Calcutta. If she had married a Bengali, one of the quiet youths, perhaps from the theatre group that had run around so furiously the day before, helping with the last-minute arrangements, if she had, as her brother had surely hoped, married one of them, she has a feeling that there would never have been such a wedding, that her brother would never have stood for it, that the young man he might have married would never have stood for it, for they had despised all ritualistic excess, or perhaps they would have given in, but not without protest, not without the bitter sympathy that her brother had accepted this one absurd request of his grief-stricken father. And now she will go back to them, bring to them a new grief, that of a daughter returned, a daughter rejected, a daughter spurned. So this is the kind of writing that we find in the pages of this novel, and every long paragraph, which runs to about 2 to 3 pages on average, is like a mini short story or a poem, and which concludes with this kind of an emotional whiplash of a conclusion. And that sort of makes this novel, despite its very difficult to follow plot, because there's actually not much of a plot, and the writing style can appear repetitive and can appear difficult, but once one gets used to it, it can be quite propulsive. In fact, propulsive is a word that I ended up using while describing to myself why I couldn't stop reading this novel this past weekend. And then I realized that it's a very unlikely word, because propulsive is a word that's used to describe something much more racier, like crime fiction or detective fiction. And yet, this novel, which is entirely about the thoughts of one woman, and as they develop over a weekend, becomes and comes to have something propulsive in its narrative. I'll say a couple of things before moving on. This novel contains among the most powerful, most sincere, most challenging, and most poignant reflections on giving up the promise of modernity, giving up the material comforts of modernity because of the hidden costs that modernity and material comfort comes with. So there are many pages in this novel in which Moni wonders what she's doing and asks herself if she's really doing the right thing for her daughter. Her daughter, who's 6 years old, is used to the food and the air and the water of London. And she often wonders how she will raise her daughter in polluted, dirty, scarce, and just in every sense of the word, precarious Calcutta and perhaps rural Bengal. Rural Bengal is a very prominent presence in this novel because Moni knows her fate. She knows that she will probably not find a place in Calcutta because, as I just read in the paragraph, she will be seen as a daughter spurned. She'll be seen as a daughter rejected. And so Moni also knows that she would choose to make a life for herself as a school teacher or a principal or a headmistress in a poor state government school in a village somewhere in rural Bengal, instead of tolerating the kinds of emotional hostility that she would have to deal with if she went back to her parents' home in Calcutta. And there, the material challenges would be even greater, would be far greater than anything she is ever used to. And while she's going through these doubts, Moni also remembers with some gratitude. She gives credit where it's due. She remembers how immature, how incomplete a person and a woman she was, culturally, emotionally, and intellectually speaking at the time. She fell in love with Anthony and decided to get married and move to England with him. She was a student of English literature. Her views of the world, her views of what was right and wrong, what was desirable and what was not, her definition of what a good life meant, all of this was skewed, was affected by her study of literature. In a way, one can say that Moni's view of the world was an emotional one. It was determined by the books that she had read. And she gives credit to Anthony for giving her something more, for giving her a solid foundation. In a way, Anthony saved her because she did not know what she wanted at the time, and Anthony freed her from the burden of choice, a burden that Moni now realizes she probably would not have carried very well. And yet, despite all of these awareness, the novel concludes in a firm resolve. All the memories of betrayal, the violence that Anthony's illicit affair has inflicted on Moni, that becomes the defining memory. And it is that memory which inspires Moni's return. A final word about novels, about contemporary novels by women writers, which very powerfully stage this moment of return. And not always inspired by betrayal or by the experience of their partners or their husbands cheating on them, but decisions of returning to one's home country after spending many years as an immigrant. These decisions have shaped some very powerful novels in the recent past, and I'll just name two of them because they seem to be fresh in my mind. The first is a novel from 2011, I think, Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which concludes with the protagonist returning to Lagos after many years of success, education, and professional writerly success in America. The other novel that comes to mind is The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny by Kiran Desai, which is published in the year 2025 and is currently enjoying a great deal of critical success. This novel also ends with a return to the homeland, as it were. Now, these returns, these passages backwards, they're not simply an acceptance of the identity that is given to us by the accident of birth. Rather, I would rather see it as an act of resistance. It's an act of resistance because in these moments, these novelists are telling their readers, their markets, but also scholars and academics who teach these novels, that identity is not simply a product of history, but rather identity is a matter of resistance, it's a matter of dialogue, it's a matter of negotiation. That's where I'll stop. I hope that this has been a useful and also enjoyable course for all of you. It has been a great journey for me, and I look forward to engaging audiences in more such courses later. Thank you.